Hi. In my last video, The Search for Meaning in a Self-Destructive Society, I talked about how the lack of knowledge of our past has made possible the current self-destructive wave of people destroying monuments and renaming institutions. Another idea that facilitates this frantic search for moral purity is the idea of the self, which however is an illusion, and indeed in the last video I said the following. When culture, that which is greater than our own selves, is forgotten, a narcissistic attitude centered on the notion of the self develops, brought to its logical continuation by the rise of social media, where no thought is thought and no feeling felt that is not broadcast to all and sundry. But first, let me offer some philosophical background. The idea of the person, or the self, has a complicated philosophical history, but it is mainly Plato who is responsible for its creation. He maintains that there is a soul, and that this soul is the core or essence of the person. By and large, when people think of themselves, when they think about personhood and the self, insofar as they think about it at all, they think about it the Platonic way. They believe that they have an unalterable essence, that there is some aspect of their persons that would be the same through time and space. People think of themselves as fundamentally the same person now as 10 years ago. People who think this way are also victims of the philosophy of Descartes, who believed that we have a mental, non-physical element that operates within our bodies, a ghost in the machine, as it has come to be known by critics, and that this mental entity is our true self. And so one might hear someone say something like, if I had lived in France during World War II, I would have joined the resistance. Or, if I had lived in America in the mid-19th century, I would have been against slavery and joined the abolitionists. Now, what the person saying this is assuming is that even though he or she would have been French, or lived at a different time, and so on, there is still something about him or her as a person that would have remained the same regardless of the changed circumstances. But this is entirely false. The proper response to this person would be, no, you would not have joined the resistance, and no, you would not have been against slavery, because you would not have been you. When we look at any person, we see a series of characteristics and aspects. Some of these seem to be stronger than others. For example, if we look at the person against whom the resistance resisted, Adolf Hitler, which is a convenient example because everybody knows about him, then the fact that he was a genocidal maniac appears to be more significant or dominant than the fact that he, for example, liked dogs, was a vegetarian, or had brown hair. But the fact of the matter is that although some aspects of a person appear more dominant than others in light of our subsequent moral judgment, they are all of a similar category, a bundle of characteristics that exist next to each other, with none of them having the claim to be the essence or true nature of that person. That is, Hitler's dislike of Jews and liking of dogs are, in terms of ontological personal essence, not so different. They only appear extremely different to us because one led to cataclysmic fighting and genocide, while the other had no particularly discernible outcome. So it is historical hindsight that makes us call one characteristic more essential than the other. If Hitler had hated Jews but never been successful in his ambition of becoming a dictator and killing millions of Jews and others, then the people who knew him might possibly have been justified in remembering him more for his dog-loving and vegetarianism than for his anti-Semitism, for example. And so the self, or the essence of a person, is only a piece of quasi-religious mysticism. And obviously, I hope I don't need to clarify here that I'm in no way trivializing the fact that Hitler was a genocidal maniac and one of history's most brutal dictators. What I'm talking about here, rather, is simply how to understand the nature of personal characteristics from a more strictly ontological philosophical perspective. That the self is an illusion was seen clearly by David Hume in a treatise of human nature, and the language of a bundle of characteristics, in fact, comes from him. But it has a precursor already in Heraclitus, who saw that various perceptions and aspects and how they interact with the world succeed one another in perpetual flux and are never quite the same from one moment to the next. You never step twice into the same river, famously. That is to say, our identity, insofar as we have one, is simply the sum total of the perceptions, both our own and those by others, of all our thoughts and actions. It is true that nothing is purely nature or nurture in the vulgar sense. We are a combination of both. But all the ways in which we define ourselves become irrelevant in another place and at another time. This is taken to its practical extreme by the protagonist in Rilke's novel Malte Lauritz Brugghen, who resides abroad and says that he doesn't want to write letters anymore because he is changing and becoming someone else, which means that no one knows him, and he doesn't want to write letters to people who don't know him. Now, that's a bit extreme, of course, but it does make the point. The illusion of the self is also illustrated in the famous philosophical problem called the Ship of Theseus, which is fully recorded by Plutarch in his Life of Theseus, and which was also picked up by other subsequent philosophers as well. As the planks of Theseus's wooden ship gradually rot, each old plank is replaced by a new one over time, one by one. But people still refer to it as Theseus's ship, even though much of it did not exist in Theseus's time. So by calling it Theseus's ship, we are assuming an essence of that object. We are unwittingly victims of our own language. Referring to some entity as Theseus's ship, or as Mary, or as myself, is a convenient shorthand, but it masks the fact that these things are always changing. But since we need to use words or names to designate objects, the static nature of the words themselves leads us, erroneously, to assume or to deduce a static essence in the objects to which those words refer. And so through our own words, we become victims of Plato's quasi-religious essentialism or idealism. And it's important to remember that this is just as true of human beings as of anything else. The concept of a person is anchored, as so many other notions and beliefs, within the narrow confines of our language, which is generally insufficient for expressing what it is that we really mean. That is to say that language makes the inherent, but in fact false assumption that sense can always be individuated. I say inherent because the very purpose of language is to arrest that which in fact is in flux. Now, we still need these words for everyday practical living, of course, but we should be aware that they are quite hollow. And so dissolving the sense of self, and thereby banishing the ego from the realm of perceived existence, becomes one of the most salutary undertakings in which we can engage. Now, there is nothing wrong with a healthy dose of self-promotion, of course, but the narcissism inherent in the notion of the self, through which we view ourselves as absolute entities, leads to the mistaken belief that other selves are also absolute, especially the selves that we encounter in history books, and who seem more frozen or static to us because of their distance from us in time. And so when the far left topples statues of our founding fathers, now to get back to the original topic, and when the moderate left serves as apologists for such actions, they are implicitly making claim to a moral superiority that in fact isn't theirs. Their belief in the illusion of the self makes it possible for them to think that they would have acted differently from the figures whose names they wish to expunge from history, but as we have seen, this is an illusion. This, of course, is not to say that as a general matter we cannot distinguish between moral goodness and moral turpitude. I'm not advocating for relativism, and I sure wouldn't want a statue of Hitler around, for example, but it is to say that the drive toward moral purification is based on the narcissism that is inherent in the notion of the self, and that we would do well to rid ourselves of such mystical ideas. If these moral purists were truly interested in improving things, in cultivating that bundle of characteristics that is properly theirs, they would strive to dissolve the moralistic ego and to reject the erroneous notion that there is such a thing as their own true essence. This would help them achieve a measure of true liberation from enslaving self-engrossment. Through that liberation, they would be better equipped to engage in true contemplation and to make the world around them a bit more beautiful. As I said in the last video, this would help them realize that there are things greater than themselves, and it would help them, and it would help them understand that their orchophobic assault in our common past is a fool's errand. Unfortunately, the self-aggrandizement of social media, whose main purpose appears to be the promotion of images of the self, pretty much guarantee that people will continue to hold on to their treasured idea of their own selves. None of this, incidentally, is to be interpreted as a rejection of that individualism that has contributed to vaulting Western civilization ahead of others and America ahead of Europe. Even though the idea of the self is an illusion, we retain bodily integrity, of course. Individualism in the sense of personal rights, a person forging his own fate, and of the state's existence by consent, is a crucial cornerstone of advanced and anti-authoritarian societies, and nothing that I'm questioning. But our individualism should not mean that we lose ourselves in false images. Our recognition of the importance of civilization and history, of the fact that there are things greater than ourselves, does not mean that we give in to some fascist superstructure that treats us like cogs in a machine. It simply means that we understand that our individualism is best served through association with others and through respect and knowledge of our common past. Thank you so much for watching, and for those of you here in the United States, Happy Independence Day.